Soon after this time, Dr. Johnson had the mortification of being informed by Mrs. Thrale that she supposed he never believed was true, namely that she was actually going to marry Signor Piozzi, an Italian music master. He endeavored to prevent it, but in vain. If she would publish the whole of the correspondence that passed between Dr. Johnson and her on the subject, we should have a full view of his real sentiments. As it is, our judgment must be biased by the characteristic specimen which Sir John Hawkins has thus given us. Poor Thrale! I thought that either her virtue or her vice would have restrained her from such a marriage. She is now become a subject for her enemies to exult over, and for her friends, if she has any left, to forget or pity. That's from Dr. Johnson's letter to Sir John Hawkins in Life, page 570. It must be admitted that Johnson derived a considerable portion of happiness from the comforts and elegancies which he enjoyed in Mr. Thrale's family, but Mrs. Thrale assures us he was indebted for these to her husband alone, who certainly respected him sincerely. Her words are, "Veneration for his virtue, reverence for his talents, delight in his conversation, and habitual endurance of a yoke of my husband first put upon me, and of which he contentedly bore his share for 16 or 17 years, made me go so long with Mr. Johnson. But the perpetual confinement I will own to have been terrifying in the first years of our friendship, and irksome in the last. Nor could I pretend to support it without help when my coadjutor was no more." Alas, how different is this from the declarations which I have heard Mrs. Thrale make in his lifetime, without a single murmur against any peculiarities or against any one circumstance which attended their intimacy. As a sincere friend of the great man whose life I am writing, I think it necessary to guard my readers against the mistaken notion of Dr. Johnson's character, which this lady's anecdotes of him suggests. For from the very nature and form of her book, it tends to lends deception lighter wings to fly. Let it be remembered, says an eminent critic, this is Malone, who has been pleased to furnish me with his remarks, that she had comprised in a small volume all that she could recollect of Dr. Johnson in 20 years, during which periods, doubtless, some severe things were said by him, and they who read the book in 2 hours, naturally enough, supposed that his whole conversation was of this complexion. But the fact is, I have been often in his company, and never once heard him say a severe thing to anyone, and many others can attest the same. When he did say a severe thing, it was generally extorted by ignorance pretending to knowledge, or by extreme vanity or affectation. Two instances of inaccuracy, adds he, are peculiarly worthy of notice. It is said that natural roughness of his manner, so often mentioned, would, notwithstanding the regularity of his notions, burst through them all from time to time. And he once bade a very celebrated lady, who praised him with too much zeal perhaps, or perhaps too strong an emphasis, which always offended him, consider what her flattery was worth before she choked him with it. Now let the genuine anecdote be contrasted with this. The person thus represented as being harshly treated, though a very celebrated lady, Hannah More, was then just come to London from an obscure situation in the country. As Sir Joshua Reynolds says one evening, she met Dr. Johnson. She very soon began to pay her court to him in the most fulsome strain. "Spare me, I beseech you, dear madame," was his reply. She still laid it on. "Pray, madame, let us have no more of this," he rejoined. Not paying any attention to these warnings, she continued still her eulogy. At length, provoked by this indelicate and vain obstruction of compliment, he exclaimed, "Dearest lady, consider with yourself what your flattery is worth before you bestow it so freely." How different does this story appear when accompanied with all these circumstances which really belong to it, but which Mrs. Thrale either did not know or has suppressed. She says in another place, "One gentleman, however, who dined at a nobleman's house in his company, and that of Mr. Thrale, to whom I was obliged for the anecdote, was willing to enter the list in defense of King William's character. And having opposed and contradicted Johnson 2 or 3 times, petulantly enough, the master of the house began to feel uneasy and expect disagreeable consequences, to avoid which he said, loud enough for the doctor to hear, 'Our friend here has no meaning now in all of this, except just to relate at club tomorrow how he teased Johnson at dinner today. This is all to do himself honor.' 'No, upon my word,' replied the other, 'I see no honor in it, whatever you may do.' 'Well, sir,' returned Mr. Johnson sternly, 'if you do not see the honor, I am sure I feel the disgrace.'" This is all sophisticated. Mr. Thrale was not in the company, though he might have related the story to Mrs. Thrale. A friend from whom I had the story was present, and it was not at the house of a nobleman. On the observation being made by the master of the house, Pottinger, on a gentleman, that being the Honorable Thomas Fitzmaurice's, contradicting Johnson, that he had talked for the honor, etc., the gentleman muttered in a low voice, "I see no honor in it." And Dr. Johnson said nothing. So all the rest, though bien trouvé, is mere garnish. I feel like Boswell's nitpicking here. Come on. I have had occasion several times in the course of this work to point out the incorrectness of Mrs. Thrale as to particulars which consisted with my own knowledge. But indeed she has, in flippant terms enough, expressed her disapprobation of that anxious desire of authenticity which prompts a person who is to record conversations to write them down at the moment. Unquestionably, if they are to be recorded at all, the sooner it is done, the better. This lady herself says, "To recollect, however, and to repeat the sayings of Dr. Johnson is almost all that can be done by the writings of his life, as his life, at least since my acquaintance with him, consisted in little else than talking, when he was not absolutely employed in some serious piece of work." She boasts of her having kept a commonplace book, and we find she noted, at one time or other, in a very lively manner, specimens of the conversation of Dr. Johnson, and of those who talked with him. But had she done it recently, they probably would have been less erroneous, and we should have been relieved from these disagreeable doubts of their authenticity, which we must now peruse them. She says of him, "He was the most charitable of mortals, without being what we can call an active friend. Admirable at giving counsel. No man saw his way so clearly, but he would not stir a finger for the assistance of those to whom he was willing enough to give advice." And again on the same page, "If you wanted a slight favor, you must apply to people of other dispositions. For not a step would Johnson move to obtain a man a vote in a society, to repay a compliment which might be useful or pleasing, to write a letter of request, and etc., or to obtain £100 a year more for a friend who, perhaps, had already 2 or 3. No force could urge him to diligence, no importunity could conquer his resolution to stand still." It is amazing that one who had such opportunities of knowing Dr. Johnson should appear so little acquainted with his real character. I am sorry this lady does not avert that she herself contradicts the assertion of his being obstinately defective in the piletes morales, in the little endeavoring charities of social life, and conferring smaller favors. For, she says, "Dr. Johnson was liberal enough in granting literary assistance to others, I think. And innumerable are the prefaces, sermons, lectures, and dedications which he used to make for people who begged of him." I am certain that a more active friend has rarely been found in any age. This work, which I fondly hope will rescue his memory from obloquy, obloquy, I don't know how to pronounce it, Obloquy, contains 1,000 instances of his benevolent exertions in almost every way that can be conceived, and particularly in employing his pen with a generous readiness for those to whom its aid could be useful. Indeed, his obliging activity in doing little offices of kindness, both by letters and personal application, was one of the most remarkable features in his character. And for the truth of this, I can appeal to a number of his respectable friends: Sir Joshua Reynolds, Mr. Langton, Mr. Hamilton, Mr. Burke, Mr. Wyndham, Mr. Malone, the Bishop of Dromer, Sir William Scott, Sir Robert Chambers. And can Mrs. Thrale forget the advertisements which he wrote for her husband at the time of his election contest, the epitaphs on him and her mother, the playful and even trifling verses for the amusement of her and her daughters, his corresponding with her children, and entering into their minute concerns, which shows him in the most amiable light? Can you, Mrs. Thrale? She relates that Mr. Cholmondeley, I guess, I know, unexpectedly rode up to Mr. Thrale's carriage, in which Mr. Thrale and she and Dr. Johnson were traveling, that he paid them all his proper compliments, but observing that Dr. Johnson, who was reading, did not see him, tapped him gently on the shoulder. "'Tis Mr. Cholmondeley," said my husband. "Well, sir, and what is it? What if it is Mr. Cholmondeley?" said the other, sternly, just lifting his eyes a moment from his book, and returning to it again with renounced avidity. Now, this surely conveys a notion of Johnson as if he had been grossly rude to Mr. Cholmondeley, George James Cholmondeley, Esquire, grandson of George, 3rd Earl of Cholmondeley, and one of the commissioners of excise, a gentleman respected for his abilities and elegance of manners. A gentleman whom he always loved and esteemed. If, therefore, there was an absolute necessity for mentioning the story at all, it might have been thought that her tenderness for Dr. Johnson's character would have disposed her to state anything that could soften it. Why, then, is there a total silence as to what Dr. Cholmondeley told her? That Johnson, who had known him from his earliest years, sensible of what had doubtless a strange appearance, took occasion, when he afterwards met him, to make a very courteous and kind apology. There's another little circumstance which I cannot but remark. Her book was published in 1785. She had then in her possession a letter from Dr. Johnson dated 1777, which begins thus: "Cholmondeley's story shocks me if it be true, which I can hardly think, for I am utterly unconscious of it. I am very sorry and very much ashamed." Why then publish the anecdote? Or if she did, why not add the circumstances with which she was well acquainted? In her social intercourse, she thus describes him: "Ever amusing till he was called out to converse, and conversing till the fatigue of his friends, or the promptitude of his own temper, to take offense, consigned him back again to silent meditation." Yet in the same book, she tells us, "He was, however, seldom inclined to be silent, when any moral or literary question was started, and it was on such occasions that, like the stage in Rasselas, he spoke and attention watched his lips. He reasoned, and conviction closed his periods." His conversation, indeed, was so far from ever fatiguing his friends that they regretted when it was interrupted or ceased, and could explain in Milton's language, "With thee conversing, I forget all time." I certainly, then, do not claim too much in behalf of my illustrious friend in saying that however smart and entertaining Mrs. Thrale's anecdotes are, they must not be held as good evidence against him. For wherever an instance of harshness and severity is told, I beg leave to doubt its perfect authenticity. For though they may have been some foundation for it, yet like that of his reproof to the very celebrated lady, it may be so exhibited in the narration as to be very unlike the real fact. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. The evident tendency of the following anecdote is to represent Dr. Johnson as extremely deficient in affection, tenderness, or even common civility. One day lamented the loss of a first cousin killed in America. "Prithee, my dear," said Johnson, "have done with canting. How would the world be the worse for it, I may ask, if all your relations were at once spitted like larks, and roasted for Presto's supper?" Presto was the dog that lay under the table while we talked. I suspect this, too, of exaggeration and distortion. I allow that he made her an angry speech, but let the circumstances fairly appear as told by Mr. Baretti, who was present. Quote, Mrs. Thrale, while supping very heartily upon larks, laid down her knife and fork and abruptly exclaimed, "Oh, my dear Mr. Johnson, do you know what has happened? The last letters from abroad have brought us an account that our poor cousin's head was taken off by cannonball." Johnson, who was shocked both at the fact and her light and feeling manner of mentioning it, replied, "Madame, it would give you very little concern if all your relations were spitted like those larks and dressed for Presto's supper." Upon mentioning this to my friend Mr. Wilkes, he, with his usual readiness, pleasantly matched it with the following sentimental anecdote. He was invited by a young man of fashion at Paris to sup with him and a lady, who had been for some time his mistress, but with whom he was going to part. He said to Mr. Wilkes that he really felt very much for her, she was in such distress, and that he meant to make her a present of 200 louis d'ors. Louis d'ors? I don't know. Some money, I guess. Mr. Wilkes observed the behavior of Mademoiselle, who sighed indeed very piteously, and assumed every pathetic air of grief, but eat no less than 3 French pigeons, which are as large as English partridges, besides other things. Mr. Wilkes whispered to the gentleman, "We often say in England, excessive sorrows is exceeding dry. Excessive sorrow is exceeding dry. But I never heard excessive sorrow is exceeding hungry. Perhaps 100 will do." The gentleman took the hint. Okay, that's enough for now. I think he's moving on to nitpicking Mrs. Piozzi on the next page. Till next time, bye from Boswell. Cheers.